Night falls early on the Alaska Range, and the world turns white and narrow. Snow lifts in sheets across the ridge, while the wind cuts the valley into pieces. Radio checks crackle in and out, a broken lifeline that forces everyone to lean close to hear. Frost gathers along the edge of a scope lens, a thin ring that makes the truth look softer than it is. Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed stands at the casualty collection point and keeps the flow steady. She is the Range Safety NCO for a cold weather course, responsible for safety and reporting to the range officer in charge. First Lieutenant Eric Shaw holds that OIC role at the field command post. Staff Sergeant Ryan Blake leads the platoon forward in the snowbound draw. The hard rule repeats like a metronome in every brief. Reed stays at the CCP. Reed does not shoot. Her sidearm M17 rides secured and clean. But the long gun belongs to the marksman element, complete with magazines staged and checked by different hands. A single line of boot prints runs away from an old firing berm and disappears into drifted dark. A reminder to respect boundaries when the storm wants to blur them. Some soldiers call her just the instructor with a shrug that fades into the wind. Reed answers with quiet work and disciplined rhythm. She keeps a tally of temperatures, notes how wind seams pull snow one way on the saddle and another way in the hollow, and records small shifts that others wave off as noise. Hypervigilance tightens inside her chest. Not as panic, but as a practice scan that finds patterns and then files them. She confirms the chain and the terms and the tools, because that is how people live through nights like this. Range Control expects clean reports. The OIC expects hazards called in before they grow teeth. Reed watches the storm smother the valley and listens to the radios breathe. The blizzard roars so loud that a person could vanish in 10 steps. Yet her focus stays narrow and sharp, planting the first small seeds of what she knows and what comes next. Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed works her tight loops while the wind scrubs the ridge clean. She powers up a PRC 152, then verifies a PRC 163 as a backup and logs call signs with a steady hand. On a small card, she writes temperature, surface wind, and wind chill, then tucks it into a chest pocket where she can reach it with gloves. She coaches a private on anti-fog steps for face covering and optics so lenses stay clear when breath turns to frost. She kneels beside the medical ruck and performs a full triple check using the March flow. Massive bleeding items sit on top. Airway tools are secured and labeled. Respiration aids are packed tight, and circulation supplies ride beside a hypothermia kit. She slides IV bags into an insulated sleeve with a hand warmer so fluid does not steal heat from a cold patient. She reminds a teammate of safe rewarming in the cold and keeps the tempo calm and exact. Reed lifts her head and reads the ground like a map written in snow. Spindrift crawls low and shows a steady pull across the saddle, while wind seams stripe the slope in faint lines. Far trees tip and hold for 2 counts. A quiet tell of stronger air aloft. Specialist Jenna Brooks watches the checklists and small rehearsed motions and grins at the ritual. But Reed lets the moment pass and keeps her focus on the work without mentioning where she learned it. A laminated dope card from the daytime zero rustles near the radio. She notes the cold bore data left by the marksman team that ran the MK-22MR, AD with a Night Force ATAC set between 5 and 25 power. She snugs a thin glove liner under a thicker pair to keep trigger feel if needed, and reminds a soldier to use dry lube on a stiff bolt. She says magazines, not clips, and keeps rank titles correct because language is part of safety. Some shrug at these habits as quirks. Yet, the storm gives up small truths to the one person, patient enough to listen. The platoon spreads into the valley as the light thins and the snow begins to close. Staff Sergeant Ryan Blake pushes his teams along the draw, while First Lieutenant Eric Shaw holds the field command post as the range officer in charge. Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed remains at the casualty collection point as the Range Safety NCO and anchors the safety net The standing rule is clear in every mind that Reed is not a shooter, and her place is the CCP. The marksman element carries the long glass and the heavy caliber. Corporal Nate Ellis shoulders the MK-22 MR-AD, chambered in .300 Norma Magnum, with a Night Force A-TAC set between 5 and 25 power. And Private First Class Tyler Wynn works as the spotter. Their magazines are checked and staged by their own hands, and their lane is outside the CCP. Reed notes their departure and turns back to her board without a word. She keeps radio discipline tight as the wind climbs. A PRC-152 rides her chest while a PRC-163 sits hot on the table. And she runs comms checks at steady intervals as visibility falls. Range Control receives short, clean updates from her log with grids and weather notes written in block letters. Each entry feels like a small anchor against the storm. Beside the radio, she sketches the wind with a pencil that writes on wet paper. Low-level drift runs left to right along the valley floor, while the saddle shows a stronger push. And tree sway on the far ridge holds for 2 slow counts. She reminds a young soldier to read spindrift and tree movement at night and to forget mirage in a whiteout. The lesson lands softly and the kid moves on. Frost rims a scope lens on the table, and Reed snaps, the cover closed after a careful wipe. She teaches anti-fog steps that keep glass clear when breath turns to ice and keeps her voice even. Her M17 rides, holstered and safe. She tracks teams by grid and keeps the casualty plan ready, while a few passers-by still think of her as just the instructor who minds checklists and rules. Snow sheets across the valley, and then the crack comes from the high ridge. The patrol drops behind crusted snow, while radios hiss and fade. Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed keys the net and makes the words clear and slow. She broadcasts RWE, RWE, cease training. This is not an exercise. First, Lieutenant Eric Shaw acknowledges as range officer in charge and shifts the net to real-world procedures. He requests positive identification and orders deconfliction by grid while he alerts range control in the proper format. Reports stutter through broken air as teams try to call their 8-digit grids. Reed writes each number and timestamp by hand, so nothing is lost. The marksman element works the slope, but the night and the whiteout are a cage. Corporal Nate Ellis carries the MK-22 MRAD in .300 Norma Magnum with a Night Force AT-CR set between 5 and 25 power. Private First Class Tyler Nguyen tracks with a laser rangefinder and gets backscatter from the snow curtain. Spindrift crosses left to right. Tree sway holds for a count on the ridge. And wind seams break the line of sight in ways a map never warned. Reed stays anchored at the casualty collection point and runs care with clinical calm. She directs march over the air in short steps. Massive bleeding first. Airway protection. Breathing checks. Circulation and shock. Then hypothermia prevention with hypo-wrap and heat packs. She tells a medic to slide IV bags into an insulated sleeve so the fluid does not steal heat from the patient. Net discipline holds, even as rounds snap into the drifts near the valley floor. Reed reminds each squad to pass grids, one at a time, and to confirm no blue forces between the CCP and the suspected shooter. She logs wins and visibility with the same pencil that started the sketch hours ago. The plan that looked tidy at sunset now sags under real terrain and hard weather. The failure is simple and cruel. The ridge hides an unmapped angle that gives the shooter elevation and a sliding crosswind. Visibility pulses and kills clean positive identification for the best pair on the line. Reed keeps the net orderly and the care steady while the storm tries to break both. The night tightens around the patrol and leaves the next choice waiting just ahead. Snow drives across the CCP, and the wind feels like it wants to lift the tents. Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed sets triage in motion using the march order and keeps her voice steady. She builds a snow berm as a windbreak and angles a lightweight shield over the litter. A sled waits with straps laid flat so hands do not fumble when seconds turn stiff. Bleeding control comes first, and she checks tourniquets. Then seals and vents a chest where breath sounds thin. Airway stays warm with a mask and a wrap that covers cheeks and nose, while a teammate counts breaths with gloved fingers on a shoulder. Circulation gets a quick pulse check and a blanket. Then she slides IV bags into an insulated sleeve with a heat source so fluid does not steal warmth. Hypowrap wraps tight and clean, and the patient starts to shiver under control instead of slide toward the edge. The net crackles on a PRC 152 while a PRC 163 stands by. And Reed keeps transmissions short and clean. One unit speaks at a time. Grids confirm position. And she writes a timestamp for every update, so no detail drifts away in the storm. A round snaps into a berm near the CCP, and snow bursts in her peripheral vision. Reed covers a young soldier with her body and pulls him behind the sled, then walks him through a calm airway check that settles his hands. Weapons stay safe even when nerves jump. She clears a simple malfunction with a tap rack on an M4 and checks that every muzzle points into a natural backstop. She reminds a pair of nervous hands to say, magazine, not clip. And the correction lands without sting because her tone is low and sure. Near a ruck, the Mk-22 MRAD with a suppressor rests while its team swaps batteries and clears ice from glass. And Reed does not touch it because she is not a shooter. The blizzard roars, and it would be easy to chase noise. But Reed holds the center. She confirms grids again and keeps the care rhythm steady so panic has no room to grow. Every action is small and exact and designed to keep people alive until movement is safe. In the middle of flying snow, her professionalism feels like a warm hand on a cold shoulder. Steady and real. Cold gnaws through gloves while minutes pass and one patient slides toward hypothermia. At the casualty collection point, Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed spots a break in spindrift that opens a lane of sight across the saddle. She breathes once and keeps the net calm. Her job is safety, but safety now means seeing what others cannot. She calls the range officer in charge, First Lieutenant Eric Shaw, and requests to observe for positive identification. She passes her grid and confirms there are no blue forces between the CCP and the suspected shooter. Shaw acknowledges and notifies range control while directing deconfliction across platoon nets. Reed lowers behind a windbreak and studies the slope with patience. Snow hangs like gauze, so she uses what the storm will give. Spindrift crawls left to right. Wind seams stripe the face, and tree sway holds for a slow count on the high ridge. A silhouette resolves where the seams pinch the line of sight and then holds steady enough to mark. Reed reports the PID, restates the clear backstop, and requests clearance for a round if safe. Authorization comes after a pause that stretches like wire. Reed eases the Mach 22 MRAD, chambered in 300 Norma Magnum, to the snow, confirms an empty chamber, then feeds a magazine and chambers deliberately before setting the selector safe. The Nightforce ATACR rides at a modest magnification to avoid scope, shadow, and she keeps the lens cap poised to prevent fresh frost. She checks the cold dope, adds a small cold bore shift, and notes that the laser rangefinder has been throwing backscatter. So distance will come from reticle stadia. The estimate lands 480 meters, and the wind hold settles close to 1 mil right for layers. She builds a natural point of aim, lays behind the stock, and smooths her breathing until it no longer fogs the glass. The rule that says she is not a shooter presses hard. Yet, the standard also says prevent loss of life when cleared and safe to do so. Reed confirms the clearance, confirms deconfliction, and lets the crosshairs wait for the moment the wind seems align. Reed sets the Nightforce ATAC-R to a modest magnification that keeps the glass bright and the edges clean. The lens cap stays ready to shield the objective from fresh frost, while she waits for the wind to settle. Her body flattens into the snow and builds a natural point of aim that does not fight the rifle or the storm. Her gloves matter, so a thin liner preserves feel while the outer pair blocks the cold. She smooths the trigger shoe with the pad of her finger and lets the hand grow still. Breath falls to a slow rhythm that will not paint the glass with fog. She checks the dope card that lives in the stock pouch and marks a small cold-bore shift of plus 0.2 mils. The laser rangefinder has been kicking back scatter off the snow curtain, so she uses reticle stadia and terrain features to bracket the distance. The estimate settles at 480 meters, and the math for drop and spin and temperature is already baked into the hold. Spindrift slides left to right along the valley floor, while the high ridge leans harder. Tree crowns pause for a 2 count. Return. And repeat, which tells her the upper layer is stronger than the surface layer. She splits the layers and sets a wind hold close to 1 mil right. A clean answer that matches what her eyes and notes have been telling her all night. The rifle is exactly what it needs to be. Mk22 MRAD in 300 Norma Magnum with a mounted suppressor. Chamber checked. Magazine seated. And the bore line confirmed into a safe backstop with no blue forces between. She settles behind the stock, lets the reticle rest on the point where the seams cross, and waits for the gust to ease. The trigger breaks like ice that was meant to break. The suppressed report is small and round inside the roar of the storm. More breath than thunder. She holds through recoil, watches the trace fade, and sees the impact take the threat out of the fight. Her voice on the radio is brief and exact and carries no heat. Target down and no secondary observed, and hold your fires while we confirm. Around her, movement stills for a beat as the reality catches up with the noise. What shocks them is not that she fired. It is the way every motion was spare and deliberate and correct. From the natural point of aim to the follow-through to the clear call. The distance was reasonable for the night. The wind red came from spindrift and tree sway. And the temperature correction lived in the card she already knew by heart. A thin ring of frost trembles on the edge of the scope and then settles. The storm keeps shouting across the valley while the net turns calm and orderly. In the space after the shot, the battlefield finally makes sense. Snow swirls back into the valley before the echo fades. And Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed is already moving the pieces. She keeps her voice level and starts the covered withdrawal with simple steps. Red team pops smoke to the north, where the wind will carry it into a curtain. Blue team peels right by twos and holds sectors, while the storm chews at their edges. She walks the radio with clean brevity that cuts through the static. Move. Cover. Set. Move. Reports stay short and clear, so nothing stacks and stalls. She confirms no secondary shooter and reminds everyone that any follow-on shot needs a safe backstop and a clean lane. A rifle coughs and dies in a pair of cold hands, and she is there without fuss. Reed clears the malfunction on an M4 with a firm tap rack and verifies function with the selector on safe. She checks that muzzles point into natural backstops as the line starts to flow again. She corrects a word choice to magazine in a calm tone that lands like a nod. Not a sting. Smoke folds and drifts. And she reads how it pulls along the saddle to mask movement. She guides teams through a shallow cut that protects them from the crosswind. A route others missed when the map looked simple in daylight. She assigns specialist Jenna Brooks to rear security and gives her the pace so the tail does not unravel. The file contracts and expands through the drifts like a living thing that refuses to break. Staff Sergeant Ryan Blake watches the rhythm settle and matches it without a fight. His hand signals echo hers as the bounds click into a reliable loop. First Lieutenant Eric Shaw holds the net as range officer in charge, deconflicts positions, and updates range control with steady cadence. Reed keeps her lane as Range Safety NCO and never reaches past the authority that cleared the single engagement. What changes is not her volume, but how others lean toward it. The people who led a moment ago start to mirror her timing because it works. She sees angles in wind and cover and movement where others only see white. In the teeth of the storm, status shifts with no speech and no glare. Only the kind of clarity that carries a team home. The route out is a thin ribbon drawn in pencil hours earlier. And Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed leads the file into it without wasting a word. She chooses the low-wind corridor where the saddle throws a veil across the valley and turns smoke into a moving wall. When the breeze favors it, Red Team throws canisters and the plume folds north to hide their shape. Blue Team stays tight behind cover and holds sectors so no one stares into the same slice of white for too long. They move by the clockwork she set on the radio. Move. Cover. Set. Move. Short reports mark each bound and prevent two teams from stepping on the same lane. First Lieutenant Eric Shaw keeps the net clean as the range officer in charge and sends short acknowledgments to range control at steady intervals, turning static into order with every check. Casualty movement rides the same discipline. Reed calls march for the litter team, and they hit massive bleeding first. Seal and vent a thin chest, and keep the airway open and warm with a wrap that traps breath. A second pair watches respiration and circulation, then locks in hypowrap and heat packs so the core starts to climb. She rotates sled pullers at planned points so no one soaks through layers. And she checks the airway every 5 to 10 minutes because the cold steals breath without asking. The rule about sweat stays in front of the file. Sweat is the enemy in this kind of night. So pace stays just under the line where people steam. She keeps them talking in low sentences about how fingers feel, how faces burn, and how boots carry weight. And she slows or speeds the column before small problems turn into rescues. Under the noise, her cadence keeps fear from setting its own pace. Weapons discipline never loosens. Muzzles track into natural backstops when people kneel. Magazines are checked by touch when positions rotate. And any malfunction waits for cover before a quick tap rack clears the chamber. A faint crack rides the wind from somewhere they cannot see. So, Reed calls a short halt and shapes the file into an L that stares down the blind corner. 10 slow counts pass without a second sound, and then the column slides forward again. The camera hugs the small moves that matter, while snow turns the world into static. Reed reads smoke and drift, and the lean of trees and steers them through a dead ground no map would have guessed. And the valley begins to widen like a fist opening. They cross the edge of the kill zone and feel space return. First Lieutenant Eric Shaw reports real-world emergency resolved to range control in the proper format. And Staff Sergeant Ryan Blake counts heads and confirms the wounded are stable. A single line of boot prints leads back to the saddle where the shot began. A thin mark that points to safety, while Reed reminds the team to check airway one more time and keep the warmth in. The storm settles into a tired hush, and the valley feels wider than it was an hour ago. Staff Sergeant Ryan Blake moves down the line and touches helmets as he counts, then checks the wounded with a steady hand. The casualty collection point holds a calm pulse now, with blankets tucked and sleds stowed. First Lieutenant Eric Shaw keys the net and reports real-world emergency resolved to range control in the proper format. They circle for a short after-action review that keeps to the bones of the night. Real-world emergency was declared on time and followed without drift. Positive identification was achieved before the shot. Deconfliction was maintained by grid, and a single precision engagement ended the threat. There was no fratricide, and communication stayed disciplined even when the wind tried to break the net. Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed stands off to the side and writes numbers rather than stories. She asks about cold injuries, checks that gear is dry, and logs wind changes so the lessons are not lost to relief. Her answers are small, practical, and pointed at people rather than credit. She lets others talk while she folds the weather card and clears the CCP for the slow ride home. Word travels quietly about who put the pieces together when it mattered. Reed once led a sniper section on a mission that stopped an ambush with 0 civilian casualties. But the record for that work sits behind a classified door. First Lieutenant Eric Shaw hears enough to connect the dots he saw tonight. He recommends her for a role that fits the skill and the steadiness. Advanced sniper instruction and tactical leadership at the Cold Weather Training Center. There is no loud cheer in the snow. Only a sense that the right person finally came into focus. The scope on the table no longer wears a rim of frost, and the map of the wind in Reed's head feels clean and readable. A single line of boot prints leads out of the kill zone and into the open. Thin as a pencil mark and true as a compass. The team follows that line out while Reed reminds them to check airway one last time and keep the warmth in. The patrol is safe, and the report to range control reads, "Real-world emergency resolved." The whiteout night still lingers in the ears like wind on metal. Frost that once circled the scope has thinned and run clear. A single line of boot prints stretches away from the kill zone and points toward home. Now imagine yourself under that sky with the radio in your hand. Orders are real, and lives are real, and the clock does not stop. You are Sergeant First Class Morgan Reed. Range Safety NCO. Cleared by the range officer in charge for one round if safe. Do you hold the line or take the shot to bring your people back alive? If this moment speaks to you, share a story about the quiet experts in your world. Tell us about the teammate who does not raise a voice but moves mountains by habit and care. Drop a simple phrase in the comments to mark that spirit. Calm wins. If you want more true-to-life stories about discipline, quiet courage, and leadership when the weather turns against you, consider a like, a share, and a subscribe. This channel tells human stories with respect for the standards of the United States Army and the bond between teammates. We avoid classified details and honor the people behind the work. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us in the snow and the dark, where a steady hand can change a night.